Hi boys and girls, welcome back. Today is Thursday and we're going to be talking about chapters 1 through 5 of Frindle. But first, before we do that, I want to go over some vocabulary words that we heard in the story. So let's see. The first one, or one of the ones we heard that you might not be familiar with, is the word crimson. Okay, what crimson is, it referred to that when they were talking about the little girl that got blamed for chirping and she turned crimson. So that would be a shade of red. Okay, so crimson would be a shade of red. Another word that we heard was pounced. When that whole situation, the teacher had pounced on that student, which meant that she moved quickly and suddenly, okay? An animal can pounce on something as well. Another word would be, that we heard, beaming. If you were beaming about something, you were probably smiling happily. You were beaming with pride. Another word that we saw was acquainted. If you were getting acquainted with something, that means you were getting to know it better or someone. Maybe you were getting acquainted with a new student. Another word that we saw was frantically. If someone was acting very frantically, they were being hurried and it was kind of uncontrolled, kind of crazily a little bit. And the last word was one of the words that was to describe Mrs. Granger, and it was primly. They were using that to describe her because she is very formal or very proper. They used that word the way she sat very primly in the back of the room on the stool, okay? So those are some words that we saw in chapters 1 through 5. Crimson, pounced, beaming, acquainted, frantically, and primly. So if you see those words again, you'll understand their meaning and how they're used, okay? The other thing I want to talk about real quick is just how we could summarize chapters 1 through 5, okay? So chapter 1 was called Nick, and some things that we saw in chapter 1 about Nick was just things we got to know him. So he seemed like he was liked to play tricks. You can zoom on this. Okay. At the time in that, he was a 4th grader going to 5th, which will be some of you guys, okay? And he, at the end of this chapter, was worried about Mrs. Granger. Okay, so that was chapter 1. Chapter 2 was all about Mrs. Granger. And we learned a lot about Mrs. Granger, okay? You guys, on our Zoom, we had our drawings. We talked about her characteristics. Strict, older, doesn't fall for tricks. Okay. Our 3rd chapter was called The Question. And that's when Nick tried to play that joke. So the question was the 3rd chapter. And that was when Nick's trick failed and he ended up with extra homework. Okay. And then chapter 4 was Word Detective, And that was the chapter with all that extra work that he had. Nick had lots of homework. Okay, and then the last chapter, chapter 5 that we read, was called The Report. And that's when he gave the report of all that extra homework. It lasted almost the entire class time. Lasted most of class. So again, he was trying to make it where Mrs. Granger could not give homework again because he wanted to use up that whole time from that extra homework she gave him. So what ended up happening, if you remember, was there was still 8 minutes left of the class, and she still was able to teach everything she wanted to in those 8 minutes and still gave homework. So she is pretty hard to trick, okay? So I want you to look at this for a second, and if you need to pause my recording so you can look at it, mainly this here, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I want you to write me just a short summary about those chapters, and you can use any of this information. Do you have to put all of this and tell me what chapters 1 and 5 is about? No, of course not, okay? Just tell me some main ideas. Remember to use uppercase letters, periods, and spaces between your words, okay? Do the best you can, and that's your assignment for writing today, okay? Thanks, guys. I'll see you next week.